to this afternoon session, and that will be the last session of this Fields workshop on mathematical finance and cryptocurrency, and the session will consist of 3 presentations. I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker of this session, Hanna Halaburda, who is an associate professor of technology at NYU Stern School of Business. Prior to joining NYU Stern, Hanna was an assistant professor of strategy at Harvard Business School and a senior economist at the Bank of Canada. In her research, Hanna studies how technology changes economic forces and thus affects business models and interactions in the marketplace. One strand of her work focuses on competition between digital platforms. Since 2011, she has built a research program in digital currencies and blockchain technologies, including analysis of incentives in consensus protocols, cryptocurrency adoption, smart contracts, and token issuance. Today, Hanna will talk about an economic model of consensus distributed ledgers. Hanna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you. I want to thank the organizers for including our paper in the program. The program, looks great, and it's a great pleasure to be in such a good company. The paper that I'm presenting today, the economic model of consensus on distributed ledgers, is a joint work with Jigao He and Jason Lee. And this work was inspired by our observation that most of modern so-called green blockchains, so blockchains that do not involve proof of work, like proof of stake Ethereum 2.0, permissioned blockchain Hyperledger Fabric, Threadmin that got rebranded as Ignite. Most of those blockchains are relying heavily on the Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols. And Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols are an older concept that classic that goes back to computer science. Computer science's classic problem of Byzantine general problem. And it has been around since the late 70s and early 80s. So what we are showing is that the application of those traditional concepts to blockchains were useful, may have its limitations, and we need to look at an economic lens to it. So let me maybe start by saying a couple of words about the Byzantine generals problem. And looking at the audience at the moment, I'm sure everybody is familiar with that, but just to kind of focus on a particular problem that we'll be talking about. A Byzantine's general problem takes its name from a following story. Imagine there is Byzantine's army that is preparing for an attack, and there are many different generals leading different parts of the army. They will be successful in their attack only if they will attack at the same time. The problem is that the generals cannot get together and just decide on a particular time they will attack. They need to rely on messages being sent between each other to coordinate the time of the attack and to know what is the time of the attack. While the messages may be lost, which is one problem, the other problem is that some of those generals that are sending messages may be traitors, and they may delay the message on purpose, or withhold the message on purpose, or maybe even send an incorrect message, a different message. And the problem is how to make sure that what should be the role that the generals should take in the number of messages that they are going to observe, at which point they should know when to attack and when not to attack. And the reason why this problem is important is because it is used in distributed databases, and distributed databases are going back to the late 70s and early 80s. And in distributed databases, you have multiple computers, multiple nodes that are updating their individual databases, and they need to all agree on the order of the transactions and not only which transactions are being recorded in their individual databases, but also in which order. So this is equivalent to the Byzantine generals agreeing, what time they should attack. The distributed databases are existing because we have known solutions to the Byzantine generals problem, so-called Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols, and they have been successfully applied since the 80s. And we wouldn't have large internet companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google if they would not be able to apply large-scale distributed databases utilizing those solutions. So the interest in Byzantine general problem and Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols has been reignited with blockchains. And this is because blockchains are distributed ledgers, which is a type of distributed database. So Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols are considered to be a good guidance for designing blockchain protocols to achieve consensus. However, what we realize is that there is a big difference between traditional distributed databases and blockchains. And this comes down to the difference in the adversarial environment. So we have adversaries in both of those environments, but the nature of adversaries is a little bit different. So in traditional distributed databases, the applications are always implemented within one particular company. So it would be Google, it would be Amazon, it would be Facebook, or any other petfood.com, and so on. So while the nodes may fail and may just not send any messages, or they may be hijacked by an attacker and they may send false messages, the ones that are working well, they will follow the protocol. Because why wouldn't they follow the protocol? They were prescribed the protocol, and their job is to follow the job in company is to follow the protocol. However, in blockchains, the distributed ledger is maintained by nodes that are independent entities, and they are individually maximizing their individual payoffs. And they may unilaterally decide whether it's worth for them to follow the protocol or to deviate from the protocol as they are maintaining the database. So that means that while there are still some nodes that may just plain fail, or they may be hijacked by an attacker, all the other nodes are profit maximizing, and they need to find it worthwhile to follow the protocols. So the protocol needs to be, in a way, incentive compatible, which is not the case if we assume the traditional structure of the distributed database. That means that there is need to analyze the economic incentives that need to be maintained in the Byzantine fault-tolerant protocol in order to achieve consensus. And this is what we do in this paper. So we built an economic model of Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus, and we characterize all symmetric equilibria. And unsurprisingly, we find that not every design that achieves consensus in the traditional distributed databases, where the nodes that have not failed or have not been hijacked, they just follow the protocol. They're called honest nodes. Then if we account for the fact that those nodes may be rational, so they may be individually profit maximizing, then some of those protocols that achieve consensus under honest nodes, they do not achieve consensus under rational nodes. And when we characterize where all the equilibria that arise. But we also show that the design of the protocol affect the cost that the system needs to bear in order to provide sufficient incentives to achieve consensus in equilibrium, so to be incentive compatible. So let me give you one example of the concept consequence of our results for the design of blockchain protocols. So a traditional Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols, and that includes most of the current blockchain protocols that are relying on Byzantine fault tolerance. They recommend that nodes should send and forward messages as much as they can, so with as high probability as they can to each other in this distributed ledger. But we show that if it's possible that messages get lost, even with small probability, or in fact, most importantly, if they get lost with small probability, it may be prohibitively expensive to provide incentives so that the nodes will find it incentive compatible to reach consensus. If they always believe that everybody is sending messages as much as with as high probability as they can, and instead lowering the probability with which the messages are sent may achieve consensus at the lower cost to the system. And I'm going to, hopefully after my analysis, this, if it's not clear right now, it will become more clear. But this is where we are going with our analysis of the equilibria and the consequence for the blockchain design. So maybe I should stop here for any clarifying questions before I dive more deeply into the model. Okay. So in our analysis, we start with the classic Byzantine fault-tolerant protocol assumptions, and these are that Byzantine nodes, those would be the possible traitors, they may behave arbitrarily. Everybody else is considered to be honest, which means that they will follow the prescribed protocol. And what is really, really important is that in this distributed system, that is peer-to-peer network, nobody has global information. Nobody sees the whole, no agent sees the whole system and has a global knowledge about the system. Everybody has just their local knowledge about what they see, what they observe, what messages that they are hearing from other nodes with whom they are connected. Okay. Then we observe that in blockchains, the non-Byzantine nodes, so the ones that neither failed nor were hijacked by an attacker, are not really honest. They are not blindly following the protocol, but they are rational, which means that they will be maximizing their payoffs. And also, they need to, given that they will be maximizing their payoffs, they need to form certain beliefs about what Byzantine nodes are going to do. And we are going to assume that the rational nodes are ambiguity averse about Byzantine strategies, which means that they will always take the worst case scenario when they will be considering what the Byzantine nodes can do. And this is in line with the both assumptions taken in computer science, but also with kind of very weakly defined strategies of Byzantine nodes, where we say they can do anything, and we are not even going to assign probability distribution about anything that all the strategies that they can take. So we are going to take the worst case scenario. We work with a very simple game that we call consensus game, and this is a game among a continuum of computer nodes of measure n. And this game proceeds in a number of steps. First, nature randomly selects one node as a leader, and all the other nodes are then denoted as backups. Then leader decides for each backup whether to send a message. And this message may be a message to attack at 3 p.m., or it may be a message that includes a bunch of new transactions to be added to the blockchain. And then the leader sends the message. Each backup, upon receiving a message, and they may or may not get the message, if they got the message, it decides whether to forward the message to each other node. And then each node collects all the messages that they have received. They count the number of messages. They look at the number of messages that they got from other backups. They see whether they got a message from the leader. And based on this information, they need to decide whether to commit a message or not. And in the context of blockchain, it would be a decision, the commit decision would be to add the new block of transactions to the node's local ledger of transactions. So something that is really important here, and especially when we talk about blockchain, we very often say that something is written on the blockchain. And the thing is that in a distributed system, in a peer-to-peer network, there is no the blockchain. Every node has its own local copy of the blockchain. There isn't one arbitrary copy of the blockchain. The magic of consensus on distributed ledger is that all those copies will be the same if consensus works well. So if they all commit, then we are going to achieve consensus. Okay. So the problem with Byzantine in a Byzantine system is that some of the nodes, and we're going to say that it's a measure f of the nodes out of n nodes that we have, they may take arbitrary actions, and they may not send or forward messages or commit with the same strategies as the other nodes and non-Byzantine nodes. And of course, the problem is that we don't know which nodes are Byzantine. If we knew which nodes are Byzantine, we would just exclude them from the game. So we just know that randomly, measure f out of measure n of the nodes are Byzantine, and they may take arbitrary actions. For the rational nodes, for the remaining nodes that we are calling rational nodes, they maximize their utility. So their utility depends on whether they committed a message to their own ledger and whether the consensus has been achieved. So, first, if they committed a message and consensus was achieved, then they are getting a reward R for maintaining the ledger. If they committed message and the consensus failed, then they get penalty because now the blockchain is in disarray and they are not they have different copies of the blockchain and there is inconsistency. If they do not commit a message, they get a 0, whether the consensus failed or succeeded. And what do we mean by the consensus failing or succeeding? We say that consensus succeeds if almost all rational nodes, so measure n minus f of rational nodes, commit the message. So with that, we get a dynamic game of imperfect information that has both components of coordination and chip talk. It is not exactly the same as chip talk game because there's one major difference, and the difference is that in chip talk, it really doesn't matter what you are, what is your communication, your strategies for the final game, post the chip talk game for your decision game, the strategies do not depend on the communication stage. Whereas in our game, in the consensus game, the nodes can only commit to a message if they have heard about the message first. So if a particular node has never received any message, then there is no way that this node can commit. And that is going to actually play a role in equilibria that we can achieve. We go for a solution, we look for an equilibrium, a perfect Bayesian equilibrium with multiplier priors over Byzantine strategies to account for ambiguity aversion. Okay. So in this game, we characterize all symmetric equilibria. And to do that, we start by considering a candidate symmetric equilibrium. And the candidate symmetric equilibrium is going to have particular parameters. A rational leader is going to send a message to each backup with probability P. Every rational backup forwards the message if received with probability Q. And we characterize, and there is a set E1 and E0 of number of messages that a backup would commit if it receives that number of messages, given that the backup also got the message from the leader or it did not get a message from the leader, respectively. So if the backup nodes never commit, no matter what they are getting, what messages they are getting, we call it a gridlock equilibrium. And we are going to, we are finding, I'm not going to be elaborating on it here, but we are finding that this gridlock equilibrium always exists. So no matter what communication, all nodes can basically say that they will ignore the communication and not commit the messages that they hear. And if other nodes do not commit, then of course no node wants to deviate and commit. We are interested, in contrast, in what we call consensus equilibria, where nodes, depending on the number of messages that they hear, they actually commit the message and therefore perpetuate and maintain the blockchain. So for any given candidate equilibrium with parameters P, Q, especially P and Q, every node that receives a k number of messages may make number of inferences based on its local knowledge, number of inferences about everybody else's knowledge, and therefore their decisions, which will matter for their own decisions to commit. So the first inference that the node is going to make is inference about the leader. Is leader Byzantine or is leader rational? Okay. So given the candidate equilibrium parameters, P, probability that leader sends a message if it's rational, and Q, probability that every backup forwards the message, and given the measures N and F of the overall number of nodes and the Byzantine nodes, we can easily find an interval of possible number of messages that the node can get if the leader is rational. So if the leader is rational, then at least the lowest number of messages that the node is going to get is N minus F PQ, and the maximal is N minus F PQ plus F times P. So the lowest number of messages is if all the Byzantine nodes do not forward the message that is sent by the rational leader, and the maximal number of messages is if all the Byzantine nodes forward the message, and not with probability Q, but with probability 1, which is different than the candidate equilibrium probability. So it is easy to see that if a rational node gets a number of messages outside of this interval, then it's going to infer that the leader must be Byzantine, because if the leader was rational, then the number of messages would be in this interval. Within the interval, it is not safe to assume that the leader is rational, because the Byzantine leader can send any number of messages and has arbitrary strategy, so it can just as well send the same number of messages that would be consistent with rational leader. But at least there's a chance that there is a rational leader within this interval. The second set of inferences that the node is going to make is about other rational nodes. So given a k number of messages that the rational node receives, it is going to infer that if the leader is Byzantine, the number of messages that other rational nodes are getting is within the interval minus F plus F of the k messages that I got. So I'm going to think that if I got k messages, any other rational node is going to get from minus my number of messages k minus f to my number of messages plus f messages. This is the largest interval that the other nodes rational nodes can get if the leader is Byzantine. If the leader is rational, then of course other nodes are getting number of messages within the interval, the blue interval. So how do those inferences translate to decisions, whether to commit or not, and therefore whether we are going to achieve consensus and continue building protocol, continue building blockchain ledger? So for that, we first need to account for this ambiguity aversion. So the rational nodes are ambiguity averse towards Byzantine strategies, which means that they assume worst case scenario. And formally, it means that for any information set, which is the number of candidate equilibrium and the number of messages, a rational node that is ambiguity averse towards Byzantine strategies will choose an action, whether to commit or not commit, such that it maximizes the worst case scenario. So assuming that the strategy of Byzantine nodes is the strategy of the Byzantine nodes is going to be the worst possible one. Now, that is actually what is really important here, is that in Byzantine environment, the Byzantine nodes can fully coordinate. So Byzantine nodes may be hijacked by the same attacker and can fully coordinate their strategies. So this is why if we have a measure F of Byzantine nodes, they may basically coordinate and very precisely conduct an attack that would be feasible for those F number of nodes, of Byzantine nodes. We cannot assume that they are independent. This is the main difference between the crash tolerance in a protocol and the Byzantine tolerance in a protocol. A crash tolerance assumes that any particular node can crash with some probability, and those crashes are independent. So the way to interpret this ambiguity aversion is in the context of the consensus game and commit decision, is to say that if there exists a Byzantine strategy consistent with the information set that the rational node finds itself in, such that a positive measure of rational nodes would not commit, then node I should not commit. Because if then the worst case scenario is then that the consensus is not going to be achieved. And then if consensus is not going to be achieved, the dominant strategy is the best strategy is to not commit. You only want to commit if you think the consensus will be achieved. Okay? So with that, we're going to use iterated deletions of dominated strategies to eliminate some impossible equilibria or impossible candidate equilibria, and then characterize the equilibria that may happen, that may occur. So first, we're going to show that if a node received less than F messages, the node will not want to commit. And this is especially true if receiving less than F messages means that the leader is Byzantine. So what we are going to show is that if the node would know for sure that the leader is Byzantine, then it will never want to commit. But the way to do it is to look through the iterated deletion of dominated strategies. So if the leader is Byzantine and a rational node got less than F messages, it knows that it is possible that some positive mass of rational nodes received no messages at all. They received no message at all, they cannot commit. And therefore, there will be no consensus. So the optimal best response, or the best response, is not to commit. But now, for any node that received just slightly less than 2F messages, they know that other rational nodes could have received F messages less, which means that they are in this red interval and they are not going to commit. There may be a positive mass of rational nodes that are not going to commit, and therefore the rest response is not to commit as well. And we keep going until we go to the other side of the interval that is consistent, and there's always this this little chunk here that we are going to go beyond the interval of consistent with a rational node, again, the rational nodes are not going to commit, because it is possible that some other rational nodes, positive mass of rational nodes, get messages, less messages, which brings them below this interval here, and therefore you're not going to commit, and so on until the end. So this way, we find that in the interval where the rational nodes know for sure that the leader is Byzantine, they are never going to commit. How about the interval that is consistent with a rational, with the rational leader? Whether they will commit or not depends on number of things. First, what we are showing is that they either commit on the whole interval or they do not commit on the whole interval. So there can be no holes in this interval. And to see that, let's suppose that we have a rational node that is on a green dot and receive that many messages, but knows that there is some k within this interval for which the rational nodes will not commit. But if this is the case, then the green node is worried that even though he got a number of messages consistent with the rational node, and assuming with rational leader, and assuming that the leader is rational, the Byzantine backups can coordinate to make sure that the positive mass of rational nodes are going to receive this red number of messages, and therefore positive mass is not going to commit. If this is the case, then it is not a best response for the green node to commit, and therefore either all of those Ks would commit or no Ks would commit in this interval. So whether we know that we are going to we always have a no commit equilibrium existing, but whether we are going to have a commit equilibrium existing where we are going to achieve consensus will depend on parameters, will depend on the reward that the nodes are getting from maintaining consensus. It will depend on the penalty for not achieving consensus, and it will depend on the proportion of Byzantine and rational nodes. And we derive a particular conditions for those parameters for each of those for different types of equilibria to exist. So we find that first what we call gridlock equilibrium, where there is never any commitment, it always exists. Unfortunately, we cannot get rid of that. But when it comes to consensus equilibria, there are two types of equilibria. The first type is the unitary P equilibrium, and this equilibrium is called unitary P because the leader sends the message to all the backup nodes with probability 1. And this is what is prescribed by the computer science protocols and recommendations. And this equilibrium exists with rational nodes when this condition is satisfied, and minus f of r is greater than fc, which means that the reward is sufficiently large than the punishment for the nodes to find it rational to commit. Okay, so this is very, a sign of the fact that we are adding constraint on payoffs. It is a standard type of equilibrium. But we find that there are also equilibria which we call fractional P equilibria, and those are equilibria in which the leader sends the message to the backup nodes only with some probability lower than 1. This probability cannot really be arbitrary. Which probability P is going to constitute an equilibrium depends on the payoffs. So first of all, the condition for this equilibrium to exist is more stringent and more strict than the condition for the existence of unitary P equilibria. And then the parameters also constrained for which probability P equilibrium is going to exist. And notice that this probability is not going to, this equilibrium is not going to exist, or it's going to be very demanding on parameters for P being very, very close to 1, but not exactly 1. Okay? Maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the reason why this interval is kind of asymmetric, and it is really difficult to find why it is really difficult to maintain equilibrium with P close to 1, but not exactly 1, but it does depend on parameters. And or maybe let me do it anyway. So the reason why we have those this interval is kind of not open-ended, and so very high P's are difficult to maintain as an equilibrium, is because if a backup receives a message from a leader, then the expected payoff from committing depends on the probability that the leader sends the message. And if the message from the leader is not received, the backup still needs to want to commit if they got messages from the backups, but not from the leader, because they know that the leader may be rational and yet not send messages to the backup nodes. So there needs to be an incentive not to commit, even if they did not get the message, because and they need to think that it is quite reasonable that the leader is rational, even if they did not get the message. If the probability with which rational leader sends the message to the backup nodes is really, really high, then the posterior probability that the rational node assigns to the fact that the leader is rational if they didn't get the message is really, really low. And therefore, if this probability, if P is really, really high, this probability is going to be really, really low. And the backup node is going to commit to the message only if the reward is really, really high. High rewards put a lot of pressure on the system because somebody needs to pay the nodes for maintaining the blockchain. And if they need to pay a lot, then we can achieve consensus with very high P's in this situation, but only for very high rewards. Okay, so both nodes who received and both nodes who did not receive a message from the leader needs to be incentivized to commit to a message, which happens if the P is positive but not too large or not too small, and only if this condition on payoffs is satisfied. Okay. So what does it mean? What does existence and this characteristics of the equilibrium mean for the protocol design? So number one is that the protocol that prescribes the probability of sending the message, probability of forwarding the message, and the number of messages the node needs to get to commit the message to the ledger, and corresponding penalties and rewards. If this protocol is such that we actually the PQ and E intervals constitute an equilibrium given the parameters NF, the penalty, and the reward, then rational nodes will have no incentive to deviate, and consensus will be reached just as the protocol prescribes. Otherwise, they will have incentives to deviate. So with that, and given the characterization of the equilibria, we can calculate the cost of the incentives needed to achieve consensus given the probability P that the leader is going to send the message. So first, we find very clearly that unitary p-equilibrium will require lower rewards than fractional p-equilibrium for the same penalty, because our conditions on the payoffs were less strict. And if we go for fractional p-equilibria, and our protocol is going to prescribe sending message with probability lower than 1, then the closer p is to 1/2, not to 1, but to 1/2, the cheaper it will be to provide incentives to achieve the consensus. And this is somewhat counterintuitive and not exactly it goes a little bit against the prescription from computer science. So first you may say, well, maybe we should just go for unitary p-equilibrium. This is what computer science algorithms prescribe, and this is what is the cheaper, and this should solve the problem. The thing is that in most of the systems, we need to account for the fact that the message may be lost with some probability. Each message may be lost with some probability, positive probability, which means that the message will be delivered with probability less than 1. And once we account for the loss of message, then we find that this unitary p-equilibria with generous constraint on the payoffs, on the payouts from the rewards and punishment, then this equilibrium no longer exists. With possible message loss, we only have fractional p-equilibria, and moreover, they may be more demanding on the reward scheme to maintain the blockchain consensus. Okay? So it turns out that if the loss of the message is very, very small, so the probability that message is delivered is close to 1, but not exactly 1, then in fact, we need to lower the probability with which we are sending message below 1 and even lower, probably closer to 1/2 if alpha is very close to 1, or we need to increasing the reward for maintaining the blockchain. So this is counterintuitive, because we would think, and this is what computer science protocols prescribe, that if message may get lost with some positive probability, that we should be sending messages as much as we can, with as high probability as we can, and not deliberately lower the message. But that may actually weaken the consensus. Right? So let me kind of wrap it up, and to drive it back to why does it matter for the design of the equilibrium. So for the design of the blockchain. So first, we know that otherwise from our work on proof of work and other consensus mechanisms, that operational success of any blockchain depends on its design. So we need to be able to achieve consensus and provide incentives for consensus. And accounting for incentives in Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols, we observe that all designs will be subject to multiple equilibria, and those multiple equilibria carry with themselves different costs for the system in order to maintain consensus, even if possible. We show the importance of information imperfection. And this is often an overlooked area in the research on blockchain, because we very often jump in and assume that everybody sees everything. And when we consider nodes moving between the forks or nodes deviating, we think that making the decisions, as economists, we often assume that they basically have global knowledge about what's going on. Whereas the fact that they need to make their decision based on local knowledge, and this is the intrinsic and one of the most important aspects of distributed networks, is really important for the design of blockchain. And small probability of message loss significantly affects the equilibria. And our model provides guidance on cost of incentives needed to achieve the consensus. We show that that it is less costly when protocol asks for sending a message with probability 1/2 if the message can be lost, and if the nodes are rational, as it happens with blockchain, which is different in recommendation from traditional Byzantine fault tolerant systems that would recommend as high P as possible. So let me stop here and allow for any questions. Thank you.